Are you ready to break free from the cycle of scapegoating and judgment? In today's video, we're exploring practical tools to help you confront your inner critic, heal emotional wounds, and reconnect with your true self, so you can finally find peace. If you've ever felt trapped by personas like the people pleaser or struggled with emotions like anger, grief, and sadness, well, this video is for you. We'll talk about how to stop fighting your emotions and instead understand and express them in healthy ways to unlock your full potential. And this journey will help you step into your personal power and reclaim your sovereignty. Yet before we dive into the process of reclaiming your inner sovereignty and show you how this can be practically done, we first have to take a moment to break down the key elements of the psyche that play a role in this journey. These include the victim child, connected to the wounded inner child, the wanderer, the inner critic, the priest, and the inner redeemer. The victim child and the wounded self here represent the part of us that has experienced unfair treatment or emotional wounds, often from childhood. This aspect symbolizes a vulnerable inner self, which needs compassion and understanding. And this aspect also relates to the wounded inner child, which symbolizes unresolved emotional pain or trauma from past experiences, often stemming from childhood. Next, the wanderer represents the part of us that feels adrift, unsure of our purpose or direction. This inner aspect often emerges when we're navigating a sense of disconnection or questioning our identity. In the process of searching for belonging, this part of us sometimes takes on extra responsibilities or tries to please others, hoping to be accepted. However, this desire to fit in can lead us to carry other people's issues or overextend ourselves, which ultimately distracts us from our own needs. With another key aspect being the inner critic, which is the voice inside that judges and criticizes, often harshly. It can be quick to point out flaws and may compare us to high standards or strict ideals that feel impossible to meet. This part of us may reflect societal pressures to be quote-unquote perfect or flawless, where mistakes or desires are seen as weaknesses. Especially in today's world, with social media amplifying judgment, it's easy to see this side of ourselves grow louder. The critic may reinforce feelings of shame or inadequacy, holding us back from being kinder to ourselves and accepting our imperfections. And this inner judge refuses to accept or acknowledge any impulse, creating thus a sort of rigid concrete block on desires which are repressed and seen as bad. Frequently, this aspect remains detached from awareness, concealed close to the inner child seeking acceptance. And the accuser aspect, resembling a harsh puritanical figure in its more extreme form, opposes the fulfillment of any need beyond basic survival, including dependency. It labels such needs as selfish, needy, weak, and shameful, or classifies them as gluttonous behaviors that must not be acknowledged. And this inner critic is also often linked to the priest aspect, which represents our inner sense of right and wrong, often shaped by cultural, religious, or social norms. And this aspect is responsible for upholding our values, guiding our choices, and sometimes even holding us to high standards of responsibility and duty. However, this internal authority can also be overly rigid or judgmental, fueling feelings of unworthiness and helplessness if we fall short. So when overly dominant, this aspect might make us look to others, mentors, leaders, or even celebrities as a source of validation, hoping they'll offer a sense of meaning or redemption. Yet while we may look to others for support or solutions, true healing often begins by reconnecting with our own inner sovereign. So instead of relying on external sources for validation or a sense of purpose, nurturing this part of ourselves can help us find resilience and fulfillment from within. Reclaiming this inner redeemer allows us to take ownership of our growth, empowering us to find balance and self-acceptance. On an individual level, the process goes through various stages. Firstly, one can use creative methods like art, writing, or dream analysis to engage in dialogue with the unconscious. And this promotes insight and understanding, which is needed to bring the unconscious content into consciousness. This tends to be mostly a cognitive process in the beginning, but should not stay merely such, as emotional and somatic work is similarly important later within the process. And this also involves letting go of the people-pleasing or strong one persona, which means releasing the need to constantly please others or maintain a facade of strength. And this is an important step for deeper emotional work and healing. Yet letting go of these protective personas can take time, because they are tied to long-standing defense mechanisms that hide vulnerable parts of ourselves, often built up to protect us from past hurts. Yet, unfortunately, these defenses can also lead to cycles of neglecting our own needs. At the heart of this process is engaging with our past pain, the parts of ourselves that feel hurt or vulnerable. This is where we need to recognize and address past traumas that have shaped us. Alongside this, it's also about addressing the inner critic, those harsh, judgmental voices that often stem from societal or familial pressures. And these voices, fueled by past experiences of rejection or invalidation, can create a negative loop that reinforces a rigid idea of perfectionism. So to break free from this, it's essential to allow ourselves to feel emotions like anger and resentment, which are often seen as negative or wrong. And feeling and expressing these emotions is a powerful way to confront and challenge the inner critic. And there are many ways to safely express these emotions through practices like martial arts, dancing, singing, or simply speaking out loud what we're feeling. And it's also important to process repressed feelings like grief and sadness, which may have been hidden away. Yet another part of this is developing a personal moral framework for channeling emotions in healthy ways, which is also essential, as it helps us avoid harmful expressions of frustration and anger. This way we can actively release repressed emotions and create space for clarity and freedom. But it's key to approach all of this emotional work with understanding and compassion, not fear or judgment, because the way we relate to these emotions determines how we experience them. For example, if we view emotions like anger or sadness as something to be ashamed of, we risk creating more harm. But if we view them with acceptance, we can release their grip on us. The goal isn't to fight or suppress these emotions, but to understand them and shift our attitude toward them. And this shift is vital for emotional processing, which involves not only our thoughts, but also our feelings and our body. Simply thinking through these issues without addressing the emotions or bodily sensations, will not create lasting change. So engaging with these emotions in a mindful way is what helps bring about true transformation. And the entire dilemma itself, what we're talking about within this video, is also very well described in a metaphorical story. And the story is about a young man trapped in a tower and cursed with a fate to remain isolated unless he can accomplish impossible tasks. In some versions, he's guarded by monsters or creatures like hungry wolves or an enchanted lake that deter any would-be rescuers or prevent him from leaving. And the tasks he's given often seem insurmountable, like retrieving a magical object from a deep lake, slaying or taming a fierce creature, or other tasks. And his success typically requires cleverness, bravery, and often help from unexpected allies, such as a mystical bird or a wise sage. And the tower is the mental tower that he was locked into, as this young prince was cast out by his father due to a prophecy, to prevent him from marrying into a rival kingdom, where this father figure set up these impossible tasks to ensure he never fulfills his destiny. So he had to free himself from the mental tower, the thought loops and inner critic, whilst at the same time rescue a crying young boy suspended by magic underwater from a lake. Reconnect with emotions, and finally slay a fierce dragon, the inner critic, and reclaim a magical item. One's primal and instinctual nature. Only then could he lift the curse and find his way to the princess who would guide him to the new kingdom. And it is kind of what happens when one's emotions get dismissed as a child, and with it anger and instinct also becomes cut off. You end up locked up in one's mind with the inner critic, often using distractions or other things like gaming to be safe in the mental tower. As outside of the mental tower, it is dangerous, or perceived to be dangerous. So the hungry wolves, quote unquote, might get to the boy, so the inner child. Yet only when he gets the courage to face the wolves can he start his journey to lift the curse. So the tower represents the mind, particularly the racing thoughts, self-judgment and feelings of entrapment. Where the isolation one feels in one's internal monologue keeps one separated from emotional depth and connection. The submerged boy in the lake, well, he embodies the buried emotions and inner child. And to reclaim one's full self, one needs to embrace one's feelings instead of repressing or intellectualizing them, allowing for a healthy relationship with one's emotions. And it is especially in the beginning key for the inner critic to just be gently observed without judgment. Just looking at it for what it is, without clinging to its narrative, nor trying to actively fight it. Because either way, it ends up reinforcing it. And first, it is about gaining the courage through boxing and any other means that make one feel empowered. And then one can face the inner child as well. And with that, one can meanwhile already start to take on the critic more strongly, merely by feeling emotions. As once one has made the connection to one's instinctual self better, one can use that to tap into one's anger, for instance, and that can help one burst through the repression of the inner critic, which will allow, more psychological energy to push through. And then when that happens, and one is ready, it is, basically go time, and one can take down the dam. And it is as much important for one to not just feel through the past pain and express one's feelings about it, but also to address the unmet needs that are connected to this past pain. So you allow the repressed emotions to be expressed directly through the technique, but also use, corrective experiences, like someone actually caring about you in a genuine manner, for instance, to also at the same time tap into the underlying emotions, which can also become something you can meditate on or journal about to learn more, where the inner child can just feel not only safe to express their pain, but also can start to feel the love and care they longed for. In the end, the key is to allow oneself to feel, but not wallow in the thoughts and the situation that created the emotions to arise. Acknowledge the emotions and their message, like with anger, that your boundaries might have been crossed. Recognizing the message it tells, but then, to let go of the situation and the thoughts that come with it. Not to dwell on, such and such is such an... But acknowledge the feeling and thoughts, but let go of both. Let them drift, like a leaf flowing on a gentle river. Because the thing is, you're not your emotions as much as you're not your thoughts. These are both fleeting experiences, which you can experience without clinging. In the end, it is about cultivating the wisdom to see the situation more clearly, to be able to let go, to cultivate mindfulness. And this includes emotional, cognitive, and somatic processing to diminish the influence of repressed feelings. So through this inner dialogue with the unconscious, one can actively confront and process inner shadows and emotions. And this step involves recognizing aspects such as emotional vulnerability, for instance, or assertiveness. And as these aspects are often tied to subcomplexes tied to the larger dynamic itself, it is important in this process to work towards reconciling opposing forces, as these often operate within dualities, so opposing poles. However, this is not a process that can be solely done alone. Connection is key in the process. because the inner child needs to be seen and accepted as it is, without judgment, which allows the person to be freed from it. And what is important regarding the process in the last stages when dealing with the victim child aspect, which also ties to the inner child, and with it the self child, is that this process should be handled with care. Sylvia Brinton Pereira in her case studies had noticed that regarding this aspect, often a certain duality is present within the tied core belief. So with this part of the complex, this duality for me, for instance, tied to the duality of either no one cares and can show kindness, or if they do, it is because they are paid to do so or have something in mind for a particular gain or hidden motive. And this belief directly also ties into the underlying unworthiness that the victim child aspect feels regarding acceptance by the self, the capital S self. This being the accepting self instead of the inner critic that is mistaken as the self. So the whole and center of the psyche of the individual. Though the final goal of the corrective experience is not to become dependent on the individual and keep projecting the accepting self onto the other, as the goal of this is the process of internalization of the experience and the tight idea of genuine kindness and care existing. This experience being key for the emotional self to realize this, as any cognitive work on its own is insufficient to have a breakthrough. Because change, and with it, through transformation, occurs through affect, so emotion. So the processing of the underlying deep-seated emotions is what thus breaks down the psychological dynamic itself. The processing of emotions is key. So in the end, this allows the tight grief, feelings of abandonment, worthlessness, next to feeling unloved and uncared for, to be processed, which is key in bringing this unconscious content into consciousness, also leading to a state of emotional wholeness as well. So how more these emotions are processed, how more of a clear connection to the self can be established, where feelings of warmth and underlying care, which tie directly to the platonic forms of the parental figures and the accepting self, can arise from within the individual, thus through this re-establishing the link with the self and the wholeness of the person. In this combination of emotional process and seeing through the dualities of the inner narratives of the inner critic, is the final push in overcoming it. Because the seemingly opposite poles keep one stuck in the narrative, and it can push one to the other pole, where you think you left it but did not. Only, if you can reconcile the polarities, do you free yourself from it. So you have to become aware of how this plays out in one's life, what they are, and then figure out what the middle way is. From this, the self-child that represents the potential within one that is hidden within the wounded inner child can unfold. So if you nurture your inner child and help to process the emotions, then you tap into that core essence, which isn't fixed or always the same, but is more like one's inner spark, one's inner fire. And slowly over time, fostering through the process of reintegration a sense of wholeness, thus nurturing the inner child and helping to set up our inner parent, the accepting self. And to successfully reintegrate the inner fragments, it's also crucial for one to establish a nurturing relationship with these parts, which involves recognizing, accepting, and showing compassion towards them. Expressing unconditional love and acceptance then further helps these fragments feel welcomed and valued, encouraging them to reintegrate into the person's whole self, which also means countering the internalization of what the inner critic makes one believe about these aspects. This requiring a safe and nurturing space for the individual to heal before they can fully re-enter society. The latter being a process that can't be rushed and requires careful pacing. And whilst the journey for each individual is personal, a shared communal space is necessary for this acceptance of the inner child to be internalized. So whilst one works through this individually, the process requires a shared space of healing to fully work. And by facing our repressed emotions and working through the people-pleasing and strong one persona this way, next to the inner critic, which tends to also externalize itself at times as judgment, we can start to cultivate non-judgmental presence, which furthers the process of healing for not just the individual but the group. Yet what is important in this process is to remember that it won't go perfect. People will make mistakes, such as feeling fearful about certain aspects or even making judgments at times. Yet this requires patience and ongoing mediation throughout the process, Yet over time, when committed as a group to it, one can thus overcome it. Through personal healing, this cultivates a presence that allows you to support others without taking on their emotional burdens. The mere presence in holding space is enough. You do not have to fix or save others, or do anything beyond listening and being emotionally present. And this path towards the state of wholeness really then becomes an unveiling, the acceptance of the shadow and the trauma and pain and suffering it holds. To sit through it with acceptance, to see through the dualities of the psychological complexes and its narratives, and allow oneself to feel all the tight emotions, to feel through all the emotions, to get back to the underlying archetypes beyond the complexes, to undo the complexes within the psyche, dissolve them, instead of trying to have any tension with them. So it resets the entire psyche back to its most primordial wholeness.